If you had the chance to sit down with someone who has an encyclopedic knowledge and seeming perfect recall of that knowledge regarding health, wellness, fitness training, life optimization, fitness optimization, biohacking, someone who has been writing and publishing books on these subjects for 16 plus years, I've seen interviews with him, I've listened to his books, he is going to drop so many knowledge bombs, there is basically no way I could mess this up, and believe me, I'm not going to try and mess this up. Ben Greenfield.
I really encourage people to live life through the lens of how can I hack my comfortable, modern, post-industrial life to engage in movement patterns throughout the day.
Hi, my name is Chris Burris. I'm a longevity expert and the chief scientist at a lab focused on a longevity molecule. My primary focus is to help people live longer and better lives with science. Make sure to subscribe and share so you and your friends can live longer and better. Well, actually, so you and your friends can live beyond the norms. Ben, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my gosh, dude, what an introduction. I guess I got a lot to live up to now. So I suppose if you can't mess anything up, it's my job to mess stuff up. I'm totally prepared to just mess stuff up all over the place, man.
Yeah, at some point you got to get comfortable with messing stuff up so that you can just get past it. So as I was researching,
that's what they say, if you fail to succeed, right?
Yep. As I was researching for this interview, I saw a quote where you said you consider yourself a lifelong curious student. And I think it would be fair to say that you are also a lifelong analytical experimenter, and that you're also a lifelong passionate teacher. And in fact, in one interview I saw, you literally said, after chit-chatting for a bit, we have gone more than 2 minutes not giving anyone any helpful information about how to live longer. At the risk of wasting 2 more minutes, where does your drive and passion for teaching others come from, and when did you realize you had it?
You know, nobody's ever asked me that question. I grew up homeschooled, and I kind of taught myself. It's kind of odd, like homeschooling these days, as you may have come across in my parenting book you mentioned, is often replicating what one might experience in like a public or a private school setting, and then recreating that at home with books around the kitchen table with mom or whatever, you know, to paint the stereotypical, you know, homeschooled prairie family. I had a little bit of a different upbringing. I just always loved to learn. I think it's a lot more nature versus nurture, honestly, even though the nurture aspect of the education that my parents chose for me probably helped to foster the natural aspects of me simply loving to take a deep dive in just about any topic and self-educate myself on it. With self-education being probably the key term, because I've never worked that well. At least that's the story I tell myself. With mentors, with teachers, with professors, I just always like to go hunt down the information, read about it, view it, and then also experience it firsthand myself. And so even my homeschooling involved my parents just like ordering, say, a math curriculum or a writing curriculum or whatever. And I just have a stack of books in my bedroom. I'd usually be done with all my studies by like 11 a.m. and then I'd be out hiking and, you know, exploring the hills behind the house and, you know, beginning to dabble with sports like, you know, tennis, soccer, you know, played a lot of street ball with my friends. And, you know, it's interesting because now I look at my sons who are unschooled. They're 15 years old. They're twin boys. And the definition of unschooling is that you look at a young human's interests and passions and desires and skill sets, and then you surround them with as many tools and tutors and activities and books and toys, etc., that foster the development of those skill sets and allow them to live a little bit more of a self-actualized existence, particularly when it comes to their education, which honestly, if you look at it through the lens of unschooling, is life, right? Education is life. And that comes full circle to the way I view my own life. You talked about how I do analytical self-experimentation, you know, or immersive journalism or self-guinea pigging or whatever you want to call it. And one reason for that is because I don't just like to have my nose in a book or be watching a documentary about a specific topic, whether it be stem cells or peptides or smart drugs or any of the kind of things you talked about. I like to go out and try this stuff and and, and see what works and what doesn't, and, what massively disrupts sleep for 3 days or gives you explosive diarrhea and what doesn't. And, I've just always been wired up to learn. And then to respond to the root of your question about teaching, well, I'm convinced that one of the best ways to learn, and even in medical school, you'll hear this phrase, see one, teach one, do one, right? And so one of the best ways to foster your learning is to teach what you've learned to others. And I've always loved that process as well, not just learning for learning's sake, but turning around and figuring out a way to make other people's life better, to love other people, to educate other people. In many cases, relate to my business, to even monetize some of the aspects of teaching into creating online courses or classes or books or the like. So, a big part of it is just nature, and then the acceleration of nature with a real focus on constantly diving in to new topics that make a little bit of smoke come out the ears, but that I think really allow for neurogenesis and neuroplasticity and a real appreciation for a lot of elements in life that you might not discover if you just wait for the information to come to you or get too comfortable operating in life with the skill set or the education that you've already acquired.
Yeah, I think I've always felt like the best way to learn something is to teach it. And then it really just dawned on me as you were describing it, the experiential nature of your journey is also the best way to absorb it. And so there is some of this selfish, I'm teaching because I actually want to know the subject better. I also want to share it, right? But there's two components there. That's really cool. So as we were brainstorming concepts for this talk, you suggested that we could focus on 6 key principles for life optimization. It should be the case that those fall lockstep with principles of longevity. Like, how long have you been working on these kind of 6 key principles, and really have they kind of solidified in your mind? So then we can jump into those 6 different principles.
3 or 4 years ago, I read Ray Dalio's book, Principles. You've probably heard of that one. It's at least a pretty popular book about principles, primarily for business, with some spillover into life. And Ray's a pretty smart guy, and I liked his approach of taking key principles and using those as the foundation for managing a business, or in some cases, investing or self-improvement. And I thought, well, gosh, there are key principles I know of for health, for longevity, right, for health span and for lifespan. And I honed it down a few years ago after reading Ray's book to about 13 different principles. And then I got to thinking pretty recently, about a month and a half ago, a little bit more about principles. And I was just analyzing my day, my routines, the advice I was giving to people, what I was writing. And I thought, gosh, I could simplify this and refine it even more. And so over the past several weeks, I have been really ruminating about and developing the idea of 6 key principles. 6 key principles, because, it's just easier to remember than 13. And the 6 key principles, I mean, we can delve into all of them, but just to open the kimono real quickly, one is movement. One of the reasons I'm talking to you while I'm walking on a treadmill right now. Another is fuel, right? Your nutrition, your diet, etc. I'm going to stop there for just a second, because movement and fuel is like 95% of what Men's Health Magazine or Women's Health Magazine or your personal trainer or the average fitness or body and brain improvement course might teach you, right? Like, move and eat healthy and you're set. And that's certainly going to be beneficial. But I think if you don't acknowledge the existence of and implement other key principles, you might wind up kind of going down the same route that a lot of fitness or diet enthusiasts go down, right? Like strict calorie control regimens and intensive exercise, often overtraining, sometimes a lack of enjoyment of the finer things in life because you're so regimented, along with a lack of attention paid to a few other key principles, namely electricity, right? Realizing that the body is a battery and operates at specific electrochemical gradients across the cell membrane, and you have to keep that battery charged. We could talk about that. And then detoxification, right? Like, no matter how healthy a diet that you eat, you still, if you're living in a modern post-industrial era and not some pristine, Himalayan monk humming on a mountaintop, are going to get exposed to, brake dust and BPA from receipts and, shampoos and soaps and conditioners and cleaning supplies, even if you clean your own home naturally, that you might experience in an Airbnb or a hotel. And, and exhaust fumes coming from your car every time you park it in the garage, seeping into the bedrooms. I'm not saying this to scare people, but I'm saying it to highlight the importance of making sure that you're cleaning up and filtering and detoxing and supporting the natural detoxification of the body. And so the other two I would mention, in addition to movement and fuel and electricity and detoxification, number one would be recovery, right? And you can imagine the things that would fall into that category: sleep, de-stressing, and even more active, proactive recovery modalities. Right next to my office where I'm recording with you, I have what I call my Zen den, where I've got things like, an inversion table and recovery boots and an infrared sauna. I even have one of those little floor-based home hyperbaric oxygen units in there, because I really value the idea of having tools at your disposal that allow you to recover faster, sleep better, and de-stress. And so recovery would be a fifth. And then finally, when we look at this from a lifespan or even a health span standpoint, you can point out the 110-year-old gin-chugging, cigarette-smoking grandma in Sardinia, Italy, walking her goats up the mountain or whatever, and she's healthy and long-lived despite maybe not implementing all the latest biohacks and, teenage young blood transfers and peptides and stem cells and whatnot. And a big reason for that is because of the significant existence of a sixth key principle in her life, which would be the spirit, the soul, right? Relationships, community, belief in a higher power, some type of intrinsic religiosity that allows you to have a moral framework for the decisions that you make in life and the way that you treat other people. And I think that's also an incredibly important, probably the most important key principle, because that's the one that addresses the one part of you, right? The invisible spirit that is going to be there shining bright like a spark, even after your body and your brain have faded and, you have osteopenia or osteoporosis or sarcopenia or heart disease or whatever else. Your spirit can be as strong and bright as ever. So that's definitely a principle I'd be remiss to ignore. So yeah, movement, diet, electricity, detoxification, recovery, and spirit, I think kind of sums up pretty nicely the idea of having key principles to operate on for life and life quality.
Excellent. So before we jump into those principles, what does modern medicine and health and fitness get wrong about body, brain, and life optimization, kind of from a longevity perspective?
A lot. And don't get me wrong.
I'm next question.
I'm not one of those guys who's like, totally against allopathic medicine. And I think there's a time and a place for things like statins and hospital stays and certain medications and pharmaceuticals to manage conditions, or even used off-label for cancer or for focus or for sleep or whatever. But, and then I realize I opened a can of worms with a lot of what I just said that we might not have time to dive into when it comes to oncology or, off-label drugs, etc. But I think probably the two main things that leap out the most when it comes to problems with modern medicine would be siloing of the body's individualized systems because of the existence of individualized medical specialties. And, when somebody comes to me for diet advice or fitness advice or health advice, Chris, I'm doing stool tests. I'm not a doctor, by the way, but I'm doing and walking through the process of stool testing and saliva testing for DNA, urinary testing for hormones, blood micronutrient testing, basic blood panels like a lipid panel and a metabolic panel, food allergy. And when you step back and look at that, I'm addressing a whole bunch of different systems, from the gut to the endocrine system, to the immune system, to the cardiovascular system, to the musculoskeletal system, to the nervous system and beyond. And the reason for that is I want to see the body as a whole holistic unit, not as a siloed part. I don't want to look at things just through the lens of, hey, let's check out your gut because anything going wrong in your body must be linked to your gut. Or let's just look at the lipid panel. Or, let's just look at, how often you're lifting weights or how healthy you're eating or how many calories you're taking. And there's just so many pieces that go into the complex human blueprint that you got to look at it synergistically. And so that's one, would be a siloed approach. And then two, as uncomfortable as it is a topic to think about, I think that there is some monetary influence of particularly pharmaceutical companies when it comes to the way that many doctors practice and treat. And that starts all the way back with medical education. And there is a real problem with an approach of simply using a pill to Band-Aid an issue that could be better treated through preventive and lifestyle modifications. Again, not that there's not a time and place for pharmaceuticals, but I didn't tell you this. When I was in college, I graduated and I decided to take a year to work in the private sector. And I worked in hip and knee surgical sales for a company called Biomed. And it really disillusioned me when it came particularly to sports medicine and orthopedic surgery, which is a career I was heavily considering at the time, because I was standing with a laser pointer, in a surgical ward, telling doctors how to install these overpriced hip and knee surgical implants that insurance companies were getting compensated very handsomely for in obese and overweight individuals who could have been better served by physical therapy and preventive medicine and weight loss, and not just ripping them apart and putting titanium into them because that's the financial model that the doctor had been trained under. And so that's just one example. The recent surge in like the Ozempic and other, semaglutide type of peptides would be, another perfect example. But it's just this idea of Band-Aiding using pharmaceuticals primarily that I think, when combined with the siloed approach, just doesn't do people as many favors as a more natural, holistic, all-inclusive, synergistic approach that doesn't Band-Aid the issue, but that instead focuses on a more preventive idea.
Yeah, I think the siloed comes from two things, right? So one of them is you get the specialty of the physician, right? So that's going to inherently silo them in that particular specialty. And then you've got the fact that you get 15 minutes with them. So he really doesn't even have the chance to like delve into other issues. It's got to be like, what is the solution that I can provide with my expertise in this 15 minutes? And so, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then, of course, the monetary input. Let's jump into each of these principles. Let's walk through them in a little bit more detail. The first one, something you're doing right now, is movement. How do we move well for lifespan and health span?
Well, again, in this post-industrial era, we live in boxes, we work in boxes, we travel in boxes, we fly in boxes. The boxes are often temperature controlled, heated or air conditioned. There's even books about this, like probably the most popular right now is Michael Easter's book called The Comfort Crisis. And the idea, and this is another quote I heard recently from my friend Gary Brecka. He says that like aging is the aggressive pursuit of comfort. And I would agree with him. And a big part of the blessing of being able to work indoors and have cushy jobs where we're able to be seated and not running from a lion or tearing up our bleeding hands, building a fence or a rock wall, is that we are in positions that from a primal, ancestral, or evolutionary standpoint are a pure mismatch for the human body. The human body, from the standpoint of metabolic disease and all-cause mortality, tends to last longer and have better quality of life when subjected to ambulation and gait patterns, hip hinging, crawling, squatting, pushing, pulling, hanging, twisting, and rotating, and even arguably getting massaged or having exposure to some type of deep tissue element. And so when you look at all those different ways that a human could move, and you consider the fact that most of us are either sitting or standing in relatively stationary positions for long periods of time during the day, it really highlights that movement should be a key principle that we have to prioritize. And it goes beyond just hitting the gym at the beginning or the end of the day. I mean, there's even data that shows that, particularly for cardiovascular disease, if you get a workout in, but then you're sedentary for 8 hours following that workout because you're sitting in your office chair congratulating yourself that you did your CrossFits, and I can just sit hunched over in front of the computer all day, you actually don't see a decrease in the risk of cardiovascular disease. And so I'm a big fan of structuring your day in such a manner that going to the gym at the beginning or the end of the day is an option, not a necessity. And so what I mean by that is, like, right now, I'm walking on a treadmill while I'm talking to you. I would be walking what would be considered a zone 2 aerobic, obviously conversational pace, but I choose to do that. And I also have next to me, by the way, underneath my desk, one of those little elliptical trainers that you can like pedal with the feet while you're seated at your desk, which lends itself better to typing, for example, on the computer. The reason for that is that low-level physical activity is something our farming, hunting, gathering ancestors would have experienced during the day. And we know, we look at hunter-gatherer tribes, that they're easily exceeding 20,000 steps a day. And when, for example, I work with somebody and we set them up on a movement protocol and they tell me that they're incredibly active, and then I look at their Oura Ring or their Whoop data or their Garmin score or whatever, and they're walking 3,000 to 4,000 steps a day, I tell them, hey, look, like, we got to creatively alter your working environment to get you 10,000 steps or more during the day. And I think 10,000 is a really good place to start. That can be a quick walk before or after breakfast, lunch, and dinner to maintain good postprandial glucose levels and insulin sensitivity. It can be parking farther away anywhere you go, a restaurant, a grocery store, whatever, and walking several blocks to get there and several blocks back. It can be taking many of your phone calls, Zoom calls, etc., while walking, either outdoors or on some kind of a treadmill in the office, like I am right now. And then littered on the floor behind me in my office, there's a couple of kettlebells. I have an exercise bike in my office. There's a pull-up bar on the stairs going upstairs outside of my office. There's a yoga trapeze hanging in the living room. There are foam rollers in just about every room of the house, along with little lacrosse balls and things that you can do deep tissue work and stretching with. There's of course a home gym that reduces the friction that might be required to actually travel to go work out. And that also allows me, even if I can't get a formal workout in, to just step out into the garage and deadlift the bar off the ground a few times. So I really encourage people to live life through the lens of, how can I hack my comfortable, modern, post-industrial life to engage in movement patterns throughout the day that involve picking up objects and hanging and walking and twisting and rotating and occasionally doing, burpees and jumping jacks for the high intensity cardio component. But it's just a matter of thinking differently. And, as I was telling a guy I was talking on the phone the other day, who was asking me what he should do during his 2-hour airport layover, I said, well, first, you got to not worry what other people think of you. That's the first part, because most people in the airport are sitting, which is ironic.
Maybe that's another principle you need to add.
Yeah, they're sitting, waiting to sit some more on an airplane. I told them, do what I do. Walk from one end of your terminal to the other end, drop and do 20 push-ups. Walk to the other end of the terminal, do 20 air squats. Walk back to the other end of the terminal, do 20 burpees. I mean, I'll often just get like a full workout in. And yeah, I travel with dude wipes and I got good deodorant, so I'm not just completely dripping with sweat when I get onto the airplane. But just, that's an example of how to just think about moving more. And it's not for the sake of being anorexic and relentlessly just like burning calories so you can eat more, right? Like some people do that. They train to eat and eat to train. It's instead to move in such a manner that your body is doing what it was arguably designed to do and accustomed to do from an ancestral standpoint, which is to be greeted with different forms of movement all throughout the day, however those can be woven throughout the day. And it goes beyond just like the traditional, hey, I'm going to go hit the gym to move mindset, and instead delves into, I'm going to hack my environment to move in as many different ways as possible during the day type of mindset.
So I have to tell you, I have put up, in preparing for this interview, I've heard you say that, and so I have put up my pull-up bar. And I just wanted to touch real quick on one other aspect of movement before we move on to fuel. How does HIIT training, how do you see HIIT training impact kind of longevity or just general health?
Yeah, HIIT training or high-intensity interval training, as I know most people probably know, is just the idea of going hard and going easy versus engaging in chronic repetitive motion cardio. It's a style of training that I think falls under the category of time hacking or minimum effective dose of training, because it triggers the same metabolic pathways, in particular pathways that allow you to generate new mitochondria and new vascularization into tissue without the necessity for very long periods of time spent training. I wrote a book on endurance training. It's called Beyond Training. And in that book, I discussed two different ways of hacking really good cardiovascular fitness. I shouldn't say hacking. I should say attaining really good cardiovascular fitness. One is what the majority of professional endurance athletes do, which is an 80-20 approach. It's called a polarized approach. It's extremely long periods of time exercising at what would be considered, again, a zone 2 aerobic conversational pace with very brief forays into very intense exercise at typically above what would be called your lactate threshold. That works if you've got very long periods of time on your hands. That would be the approach that if you got 30 hours a week to be able to train for an Ironman triathlon, definitely do a polarized approach. When I used to race Ironman and I wound up doing 13 of them, I would instead train about 10 to 12 hours a week. Whereas my competitors, like some of the guys I knew locally, would go to the pool and swim like, 3 1.5K repeats at aerobic pace. I would get in the pool, do a quick warm up, and do 10 100-meter sprints all out with long, luxurious recovery periods in between each. And that style of training allowed me to get really good aerobic fitness in a fraction of the time of my competitors. It's harder mentally, right? There's actually a higher risk of injury too anytime you're going harder. But as long as you control for injury, you move well, and you recover well, it can be a really great way to train. And thousands of studies have shown that high intensity interval training, going hard, then allowing yourself to recover, then going hard again, can allow for better VO2 max, better lactate tolerance, really good gains in cardiovascular fitness in a shorter period of time. And the number one mistake people make when they're doing HIIT training is they see this research and they go out and they kind of sort of go hard and then don't really recover enough, then kind of sort of go hard. True high-intensity interval training is pretty, pardon the expression, balls out. Like, you hear about a Tabata set, for example, of 20 seconds hard, 10 seconds easy, 8 times through, and people do the math and they're like, oh gosh, that's just 4 minutes of training. I can do that. If you actually do a true Tabata set, you're not going to want to look at the exercise bike again for at least a couple of days because it's so hard and so all out. So I do have to emphasize that high-intensity interval training actually is high-intensity interval training. It's very hard, but then you're done. So it's a really great way to train, but you just have to be willing to dig deep and go to the well and go hard. And even when I used to do interval training for triathlon again, I would sometimes just, for a run, make a track that was 5 really, really good, upbeat, hard songs and 5 easy songs. And I go out for my run and I use hard songs to motivate myself to go hard, and then the easy songs to recover. And sometimes you have to use little hacks like that. Like, all right, just run to the next telephone pole. Or you can even go for a walk and at each telephone pole sprint for 50 meters. And you can use little tricks like that to break things up for your interval training. But it can be a really good way to train.
You are enjoying, well, at least I hope you're enjoying, the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. Make sure you subscribe, make sure you follow, and make sure you share. But don't be that annoying guy, whatever you do. Don't share it with people who aren't actually interested in living beyond the norms. So mentally grueling, physically grueling, I think that's a fair description of proper HIIT training. But first principle is like hack your environment so you can get that movement on a regular basis. The next principle is fuel. What's the best diet, and do we need to include supplements?
Those are two big questions. The dirty secret in the nutrition industry is that if you want to make a lot of money, you write a book about the one single perfect diet for all of humankind, whether it's paleo or vegan or carnivore or keto or whatever, and then you convince everybody that that's the perfect diet for all of humankind. Now, if we were going to say there is a perfect diet for everybody, you could make an argument that based on epidemiological data, that some semblance of a whole foods-based, somewhat low-carb, Mediterranean-esque diet, rich in omega fatty acids, particularly omega-3 fatty acids, works well for a wide variety of people. However, we live in an era where you can go out and you can test your DNA. You can test your vitamin D. You can test, your gut, your yeast, your fungus, your bacteria, and the biome composition of your gut. You can do a lot of those tests I was mentioning earlier, and then you can step back with that data paired with your activity data and your goals and say, okay, this is the diet that would actually be right for me. I mean, in the latter pages of my book, Boundless, I spell out the 13 diets that I tend to use the most with clients based on their needs. And then I have a table and a graph for, okay, if your bloods and your lab work and your DNA look like this, then use this diet. Or if it looks like this, use this diet. But the fact is that the ketogenic diet that helped your neighbor lose 20 pounds might totally screw you over because you have familial hypercholesteremia and you have an inflammatory response to high saturated fat intake, or you have a poorly functioning liver and gallbladder, or you have an ApoE4/E4 gene that would dictate higher risk of Alzheimer's with high fat intake. And so that ketogenic diet just might not be the right diet for you. Whereas, say you're hardwired for something that's a little bit more plant-rich, high in flavonols and polyphenols, slightly higher carbohydrate, etc., and that might be a diet that for your spouse causes a great deal of gas and bloating and fermentation and digestive distress because your spouse is very sensitive to plant-based defense mechanisms like lectins and glutens, or they've got small intestine bacterial overgrowth and get a lot of bloating and gas in response to higher intake of carbohydrates and starches. And so maybe your partner would do better healing their gut on like a 12-week carnivore diet before they jumped into a more widely varied diet that's rich in vegetables and fruits and fiber, etc. So as you can imagine, it's very complex, the answer to your question. That's why I think customization is the key. But if you step back and you look at the blue zones, even though there's a lot of controversy about how accurate that data is, these areas around the world like Nicoya and Loma Linda and Sardinia and the like that seem to have a higher proportion of centenarians or long-lived individuals. Again, there's some controversy about birth records and about the way some of that data was collected and about the very small sample sizes, say in places like Loma Linda. But you do see patterns that you could apply to just about any diet. Eating in a parasympathetic state, often with people celebrating food, relaxing, chewing the food, and eating mindfully, thus allowing for less preponderance of things like leaky gut syndrome or, overeating, lack of the hormones produced that allow you to feel fuller faster because you're just eating distracted or stressed. You see a high intake of whole foods and a wide intake of a wide variety of herbs and spices and plants paired with a low intake of eating out of crinkly packages, like ultra-processed foods rich in preservatives and vegetable oils and added sugars. So you see a very whole foods-based approach, whether it's high carb, low fat, or high fat, low carb, or plant-based, or meat-based, or whatever. You just don't see a lot of ultra-processed foods. You also tend to see some semblance of fasting, whether religious fasting or detoxification-based fasting or intermittent fasting or fasting based on the need to hunt and gather in certain seasons. And so I think that incorporating some semblance of fasting or caloric restriction on a systematic basis, no matter what the dietary composition of the foods that you're eating are, is pretty smart. And you also see a wide intake of a lot of different fermented beverages, whether it be natural wine or beer or, liqueurs and digestifs, like the Ibo Libo in Italy or the Plankovic in Croatia, these, alcohols that are rich in a variety of different wild plant extracts. And I think even though Loma Linda wouldn't be a place where much alcohol is consumed, I think small intake of some of these hormetic stressors can actually be beneficial. I have a little glass of organic red wine or a little bit of liqueur with lemon and bitters and sparkling water or apple cider vinegar at night. And I think in the same way that heat stress could kill you in high amounts, but is good for you in small amounts, like a sauna practice, or, cold could also kill you if you spend too much time in it, but it's good for you, we know, in small amounts, like, quick 1 to 5 minute bursts of cryotherapy. Even exercise turns your muscles into World War II, right? But afterwards, if they're allowed to recover, they bounce back stronger than ever. And I think if we just myopically avoid anything that might be converted to a so-called poison in the body, we might actually be excessively restricting a lot of the plants and herbs and spices and elements, particularly of the plant kingdom or the fermented beverage kingdom, that could actually be good for you long-term. The trick is moderation of the volume of consumption of any of those items, like gluten or lectins or alcohol or whatever, and not necessarily the complete elimination of them. And that leads me to my last point, and that is that with these natural diets, you'll see a great deal of care put into deactivating the natural plant defense or animal defense mechanisms, like fermentation, soaking, sprouting, rinsing. When I make overnight oatmeal, it's warm water and apple cider vinegar, and I rinse it all. Then I leave it overnight. So I'm pre-digesting a lot of the lectins and the gluten in the oatmeal. When my wife makes bread, she uses a fermented sourdough process. So you deactivate a lot of the phytic acids and the gluten in the bread and make it more digestible. When we have quinoa, where we rinse it and we soak it at least 3 times to get a lot of the saponins, the soap-like irritants, off of the quinoa. When I know this grosses some people out, but like when I make liver, I soak it in buttermilk or kefir for 24 hours to pre-digest and enzymatically degrade a lot of the collagen and take out a lot of the gamey flavor so the meat becomes more digestible and more palatable. And so you see that a lot in these areas where people are experiencing a good combination of lifespan and health span. Is attention paid to almost like a slow food or at least a mindful preparation of food rather than just eating it and assuming the body's just going to be able to handle whatever toxins or plant defense mechanisms might be in those foods. So those are a few examples of common characteristics that you'd see no matter the diet. And then when it comes down to supplements, the other part of your question, you could certainly, with a properly comprised and very nutrient-dense diet, like a nose-to-tail based animal diet with a lot of organ meats like kidney and heart, and again, liver, bone marrow, bone broth, wide intake of plants and herbs and spices, all grown in natural soils rich in minerals that haven't been stripped of their mineral content, a low-stress lifestyle, not doing a lot of training at the gym, so you're not needing excess amino acid or creatine or omega-3 fatty acid requirements, and a relatively good set of blood work without a lot of genetic risks, you could make a case that you could get by pretty well without supplementing. But when you look at human beings and even the animal kingdom for all of time, whether it's mortar and pestle to grind up plants and herbs and spices to make different teas and tinctures and medicines and potions and oils and tinctures, or whether it be modern day encapsulation technologies or liposomal under the tongue technologies or, suppositories or IVs or whatever, like, in a way, we've harnessed and concentrated nutrients from different parts of the plant kingdom or synthesized certain things in a lab, even in modern times, that allow us to cover a lot of nutrient deficiencies, think faster, think better, perform better at the gym, and just have a better life based on covering up holes, so to speak, from a nutrient or a vitamin or a mineral standpoint. So yeah, I don't think supplements are necessary, but I definitely think they are an upgrade for life in many cases. It becomes all the more important if you're not able to eat a perfect diet, so to speak.
So from the perspective of diet, I'm hearing customize, right? Like know your numbers, right? Get some background testing and understand what the right diet is for you. And supplements is at least a probably. Let's jump into principle 3. So we're on number 3, and we've taken a bit of time. So I just want to make sure we can get through all of these.
Okay,
this is an interesting.
I'll make sure I stay even briefer to the point for these next few.
Well, and it's if you've got the extra time, I'm happy to experience that. If you don't, I totally understand. So this is an interesting one, principle 3. It's not on the radar of many, but you talk about the body as a battery. What exactly do you mean, and how do we optimize that battery?
Yeah, like I briefly mentioned, the way that your cells work is they should have a somewhat negative charge on the inside of the cell and a somewhat positive charge on the outside of the cell. That allows for proper cellular metabolism and depolarization and the production of ATP and even the proper movement of hydrogen ions across the mitochondrial membrane to burn calories to generate ATP. And if you can keep that membrane polarized properly, then you're going to have better metabolic rate and better energy, or as I call in my book, like my shtick, right, is boundless energy. Well, a big part of that comes down to keeping the body's battery charged. You can also think about photons of light, particularly light from sunlight and the red light and the infrared light spectrum. Those photons of light can penetrate the skin and they can activate or excite electrons within the body. And so light is also a component of keeping the body properly charged from an electrical standpoint. You can also look at the surface of the earth, which produces negative ions that you soak up if you're walking on the beach or swimming in a natural body of water or laying on your back in your backyard. And those negative ions also help to restore proper electrochemical balance to the body, especially when combined with the fact that the earth naturally emits a frequency of about 3 to 100 hertz, depending on what part of the planet you're standing on. And that natural electrical frequency can also help out quite a bit with the body's electrical balance. That's probably why in the realm of biohacking, an area I play around in quite a bit, things like grounding mats and earthing mats for inside your home and your office are quite popular for people who can't be outside barefoot. There's another form of therapy called pulsed electromagnetic field therapy, or PEMF. Like I sleep on a PEMF mat at night. It's under the top sheet of my mattress, and that also allows my body to stay properly charged. There's a light panel next to me here, like a red light panel, and I'll use that panel in the morning or in the evening to get photons of light, in addition to getting out and getting natural sunlight as much as possible. Now, when it comes to the way that the battery gets drained, it's typically just a lot of exposure to so-called man-made electricity, dirty electricity, radio frequencies, AC surges in your house. And so, for example, my entire home is hardwired with Ethernet cables, so I don't have to have the Wi-Fi on as much. I've got dirty electricity filters in each room. I am very selective about the type of appliances that I use. I don't like anything that can't have Wi-Fi disabled or even Bluetooth disabled. I use the old school wired headphones when I'm on my phone, and my phone is in airplane mode most of the time, and when it's not, at least Wi-Fi and Bluetooth are disabled unless they need to be on. And so I'm constantly aware of all the different electrical inputs, including even flying on an airplane, and and the different strategies I'll use for that to allow the body to maintain its natural electrical balance without that battery getting drained. And I think a lot of people would be really well served by digging into this. And you can have a building biologist visit your home or your office to check out the wiring and see what kind of surges or electricity you're getting exposed to. You can read books like EMF by Dr. Mercola or the Non-Tinfoil Hat Guide to EMFs by Nick Pinault, and kind of really wrap your head around this idea of using light and earthing and grounding to charge the body, and then avoiding a lot of dirty electricity to keep the body's battery from getting drained. And so many people feel so good when they start doing this stuff. But it's just a matter of being aware of it and starting to implement it on a regular basis and making it just as important as the way that you move and the way that you eat.
Yeah, I think, getting outside and grounding is probably one of the least expensive things that we'll talk about today. Like just take your shoes off and get out into the dirt and grass. All right, number 4 is detox. Let's not skip that. What are the main things we need to detox from, and what is the best way to detox from those toxins?
Yeah, earlier I mentioned, the volatile organic compounds you get from fumes and cleaning supplies and off-gassing of furniture and carpet. There's also, roads that have brake metal and high amounts of dust that you'll find in many homes, especially homes that have been swept or vacuum cleaned improperly, or homes where shoes aren't removed before people come in. You also tend to see, of course, whether you know it or not, toxins that you might be consuming from food, preservatives, chemicals, artificial sweeteners, artificial colors. Many pharmaceuticals and even supplements have adjuvants in them that build up in the body. There's even, a lot of medical procedures that contain adjuvants, whether it might be a surgical procedure or even just, an injection or an IV that you might get that's exposing you to microplastics and metals and all sorts of other things that you might find in medical care. And although I could talk until I'm blue in the face about all the different sources of toxins that we're exposed to, because of that, I don't think it's a good idea to just wait until after Christmas around January and say, hey, I'm going to do my 5-week bone broth fast or my, patchouli oil ghee, Himalayan oats cleanse from India, or, some crazy acupuncture, diarrhea and vomit inducing, Chinese traditional medicine detox. I think it's instead a really good idea.
Although great conversation pieces at the Thanksgiving table.
That's right. That's right. Why did you bring your enema bucket to Thanksgiving? So the idea is that even though sometimes if people have been living a very toxic lifestyle, a more intensive detoxification period can be helpful, I live my life with just natural elements of detox spread throughout the week. Don't laugh, but when I get up in the morning, I jump up and down on a mini trampoline for 5 minutes to get my lymph fluid circulating. I get in a sauna 4 to 5 times a week. I use an infrared sauna, and I get a deep sweat for 20 to 30 minutes to engage my body's largest detoxification organ, my skin. I take glutathione before I go to bed at night to support my body's detoxification process while I'm asleep. I'll even take things if I drink alcohol to digest the acetaldehyde toxin from the alcohol, like a shot of Z-Biotics, which is a probiotic that digests acetaldehyde, or dihydromyrisatine, which is an extract from milk thistle, which can also help to break down acetaldehyde. I'm constantly stepping back and looking at what I've been exposed to and what I might need to put in my body to help with that. I'm supporting my body's detoxification pathways primarily through supplements, like I mentioned, like a milk thistle extract or glutathione, binders that I might use before the sauna, like charcoal or chlorella, and then regular movement, even jumping down on a trampoline, which, by the way, the reason I do that is the G forces will allow for lymph fluid to circulate much better in a much bigger way than you might get while just walking or weightlifting or riding a bicycle. That's why trampolining works. It's not just like this silly old person thing. It's the G forces, and that's how it actually works, going up and down rapidly. And it's much easier than going to the fair every day and getting on the Gravitron ride. The basic idea here is that if you live your life eating a relatively clean diet, managing your exposure to toxins by using natural cleaning supplies and being selective about what air fresheners you might use, or perfumes or fragrances or shampoos or soaps or whatever, and then you sweat frequently and do some form of regularly scheduled detoxification as a part of your life, I think that's a really good way to keep the body cleaned up. And I'll just say this because I already said it once when I was joking about Thanksgiving. I actually do think that coffee enemas are pretty good for detoxification. And when I found out on both my mom and my dad's side, I have a higher than normal risk for colon cancer, I started doing a coffee enema once a week. I'm 41 now. I'll be 42 soon. I've had 3 colonoscopies, and every single one was squeaky clean. Perfect. And I'm not saying that's all because of coffee enema. I'm also careful with how much red meat and alcohol and other compounds that I take in. I exercise. I do a lot of things that would lower my risk for colon cancer. But I do think that coffee enemas are underrated as a strategy for detoxification. Just make sure the coffee's not too hot.
Or too icy. That might also be uncomfortable.
That's it.
All right. Next is recovery. You talked a little bit about your Zen Den. Dig into that a little bit more. And what's your favorite, we'll call it, toy in your Zen Den?
Oh, Man, like choosing my favorite child. Well, okay, so radically change your environment, you need to radically change your habits, right? So I think if you're going to have a habit of just doing some really intense recovery for the body, it's nice to have a part of the house where you can do that in. It used to be my bedroom when we were in a smaller house. Now that I have an extra room in the house, I have my sauna in there, like I mentioned. I've got that mini trampoline in there. I've got a bunch of foam rollers and massager devices, like massage guns and stuff in there. I've got compression boots that you can pull on that allow your blood to be pushed from your legs back up towards your heart, which is nice if you do squats and deadlifts and lunges or ride bikes or run or whatever. It kind of helps the legs feel light as a feather and helps to circulate blood and lymph back up out of the legs. I even have some crazy things in there. I have this one thing called a biocharger. It's got a Tesla coil that runs up through these 9 different noble gases. It's crazy. You can Google it and look at it, but it has recipes on it for inflammation or for lymph or for, intestinal flow or for energy or for sleep. And so that produces radio frequencies that are natural, red light, pulsed electromagnetic fields, and negative ions. So as you can imagine, but I'll sometimes like turn that on in the morning and just do a session with that. I've got a pulsed electromagnetic field therapy, like I was talking about in there, which you can think about like exercise for your cells. It's kind of like taking all those natural healing frequencies you would get if you were walking outside barefoot and concentrating them and amplifying them via a coil that's typically delivered via a mat or a chair or a bed that you might sit in or lie on. And then I have a hyperbaric chamber in there, for getting the combination of pressurized oxygen and oxygen that you breathe through a mask to enhance recovery and tissue oxygenation. I would say that out of all those things I have hanging around, that I will usually just carve out 15 minutes in the morning to use. And then I also allow myself a half hour after lunch every day to go in the Zen den and just do whatever I want to do. Meditation session, siesta, nap, whatever. I actually have that set aside. I don't schedule calls after lunch. So I go in there and just recover. So I get often in a typical day, I'll get 45 minutes in there if you add it all up. And so probably my favorite is my hyperbaric chamber. I realize that's unfair because it's kind of expensive and a weird thing that takes up about the space of a sleeping bag. But I like it because I zip myself up and I put on the oxygen mask and nobody can get to me. It's like a sensory deprivation chamber. And I'm just kind of cut off to the world in my own space, phones off. And I'll just lay in there and I'll read my Bible or I'll pray or I'll meditate or sometimes I'll take a little nap. And even though all the stuff in the Zen den is amazing for helping out with recovery, I think the favorite one for me right now is hyperbaric oxygen. So it's abbreviated HBOT. And the one I have is a HBOT USA unit. It's a soft shell home unit.
Yeah, I interviewed him. His name escapes me right now, but I interviewed him for this longevity summit. And
pretty Jason Summers.
Yes, yeah. He's just filled with data. It was pretty awesome. Okay, and you just mentioned potentially in the HBOT, you're potentially praying. I think that leads us to principle number 6, spirit. And I think this is often undervalued in the blue zone people, right? Like you touched on it a little bit, but a lot of what's prominent in blue zones is this relationship with their community and with people in their community. But talk about this spirituality and why you think it's so important.
Yeah. I used to kind of have my priorities ass backwards, meaning I'd wake up and work out and then sometimes have some family time and work some more. And I didn't really have much of a spiritual practice, even though I was raised in a Christian house. I just never really thought much about training my spirit the same way as I'd train my body or my brain from a fitness standpoint. The spiritual disciplines. There's great books, one by Donald Whitney. It's actually called The Spiritual Disciplines. There's another one by Adele Calhoun called The Spiritual Disciplines Handbook. And they go into fasting and silence and solitude and meditation and devotions and community and charity and relationships and prayer and singing and worship. And all these elements that I think are just as important as movement and diet and detox and, the other strategies that we talked about. But a lot of people just skip it because you don't see the results right away, or the results are subtle, even though I don't really think they're subtle. I think my happiest, best most productive, most fulfilled days are the days where I have an amazing devotion session in the morning with prayer and Bible reading time and connection to God and gratitude and purpose statements. And for me, when I had this light bulb moment of, hey, put God first, and then my family, my wife and my kids next, and then my health next, and then business last, everything just became so much more fulfilling. So now I wake up, and I have a little app I use called Bible in a Year. I think it's BibleInAYear.org. And I go through all the reading and the prayers and that. And then I say a prayer myself. And that's like 15 minutes in the morning. And then I'll go about my morning. And when the family's up, I gather the whole family at about 7 a.m. in the living room. And we all meditate and pray. And sometimes we do breath work or listen to a song or listen to a devotional. But we have this so-called family huddle where we're all building each other up spiritually and learning spiritually and feeding our spirits. Same thing in the evening. At night, we all gather in my son's bedroom and we all memorize one Bible verse every single night, new Bible verse, to put these positive words on our heart. And then we pray. And then we go into bed. And my wife and I, last thing we do on our heads at the pillow, we pray for our lives. We pray for our sons. We pray for the next day ahead. We thank God for our blessings. And it's an amazing relationship builder too, to just pray with your spouse each night before you go to bed at night. And so, I also do a lot of community type of projects. Right now I do Meals on Wheels delivery every week, picking up food and delivering it to people in the community who are sick or who are old. We go to church every weekend and sing and gather with other people there who have a spiritual practice. And I think that systematically weaving some form of spiritual disciplines into every day is something that a lot of people don't realize is one of the most fulfilling things that you can do. It's the most fulfilling thing, I think, in my entire life. And so, I think some form of a spiritual practice is a game changer. But I have to say again, I'll emphasize this one more time, Chris, you need to put on the calendar. You need to say like, okay, I meditate at 6 a.m. or read my Bible at 6 a.m. And if you have a family, like we do family devotions at 7 a.m. And, every night after dinner in the bedroom, we do prayer, we sing a song. And every night before I go to bed, I say a prayer with my wife or my husband. It's like brushing your teeth or working out or having a meal. You just weave these things throughout your day. And eventually the spiritual disciplines just become as rote and automatic and programmed into your day as all the other things you might be doing to improve your lifespan and your health span. And it's a real game changer, man.
So could we kind of summarize that as like have a purpose bigger than you? Like, so some people, the religion may not be the thing, but to have a purpose bigger than you is really kind of what you're talking about?
I think having a purpose statement for your life that's single, that's succinct, that's memorizable, that you write down, that you revisit on a regular basis is one part of a spiritual practice. There are many other elements though, relationships, community service, singing, prayer, some type of a belief pattern that's based on some semblance of absolute morality and definitions of right and wrong. Like there's a lot that goes into a spiritual practice, but purpose is definitely a huge, huge part of it. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. All right, so now we've gone through the 6. We've got movement, the summary, not summary, but a key point, 10,000 steps. Fuel, customize, figure out the right diet for yourself. Battery, get rid of dirty electricity to the best of your ability. Incorporate light and grounding. Detox, so manage the toxins that are coming in and then have some sort of detox protocol. We could say sauna, glutathione, milk thistle. Recovery, I just jotted down, you have a gym, right, potentially, or at least a space you work out. Have also a spa, a place where you recharge, like have the same focus to exercise as you do to recovery. And then spirit, like purpose and relationships. I think that's pretty amazing. I know our time is right up. I do have some wrap up questions if you still have time, or we can just kind of wrap up here.
I'll tell you what, let's compromise. Let's do wrap up questions, but we'll make them rapid fire. I promise you 20 seconds or less on each one.
Perfect. Do you have a target age you want to live to?
Nope. I want to live as long as I'm able to, living on my purpose as best I can, loving as many people as possible, taking care of my body, but not myopically choosing life extension, and instead choosing enjoyment and loving and blessing others and living out my life's purpose. And however long I live, that's how long I live.
Awesome. Do you think that there is a limit to how long humans can live? And like, what would you throw, like a ballpark, would you throw that limit?
Based on all the data I've seen, which obviously sometimes medical records and birth records can modify a little bit, I think we're looking at somewhere between 150 and 120 years old, and it's probably going to be a woman. And I think that's the longest we can go right now.
So we're out of the running. All right. 2 to 3 protocols, habits, mindsets. Let's call them shortcuts for longevity and a long health span.
Cold bath, cold soak, or cold shower every single day of the year at some point. Doesn't have to be long, 1 to 5 minutes. Get cold every day. Do something that involves heavy lifting or heavy loading 3 times a week. And turn off all the lights in your home and the lights on your devices as much as possible once the sun has set in whatever area of the world you happen to be in, and instead switch to red light headlamps, candle lights, red incandescent lights, and blue light blocking glasses.
Ben, how can people contact you?
Well, they can't, because I've made myself very difficult to be able to contact, but you can find...
I've seen those emails.
You can find a lot of my stuff. You go to bengreenfieldlife.com. Most of my stuff's over there. Like, you can leave questions for my podcast. I just did like this new master class where I had a film crew live with me for a week and just filmed like the sleeping routine and the refrigerator and the pantry and making meals and productivity habits and the way my office is set up, and created this, probably the biggest, coolest piece of content I've made yet. It's a master class. It's called the Ben Greenfield Life Masterclass. I know that my team before our call set up some kind of like a discount code for all.
I've got it. I'll share it.
People who are watching. So I'm sure you can share that wherever people are watching this. But I think that would be a really great jumping off point for folks that I'm giving you guys a discount on.
Okay, excellent. That's bengreenfieldlife.com/masterclass. Last question. What in the near future are you excited about?
Well, I could say AI and GPT if I wanted to be like everybody else, but I think what I am most excited about is I'm seeing a younger generation who is beginning to get tired of the same old educational standards and the same old lifestyle patterns and the same lack of purpose and the same lack of movement and the same general lack of drive that I think is what made, for example, this country great in the first place. And I'm excited to see the next generation come up and make this world a better place. And I want to do everything I can from an educational standpoint to foster that. So that's what I'm excited about.
Awesome. You can find him, bengreenfieldlife.com/masterclass. There is a discount code if you're interested. It's Uncover20 for 20% off. Ben Greenfield, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Chris. That was awesome. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Live Beyond the Norms podcast. Make sure to subscribe and follow. Also, make sure not to be that guy, the guy sharing this podcast with people who are not interested in living beyond the norms. If you would like to learn more about the ESS60 molecule, the molecule responsible for the single longest longevity experimental result on mammals in history, a full 90% extension of life, visit myvitalc.com. That's myvitalc as in carbon.com.